I'm now really excited to introduce our next keynote and panel. And it's not very often that I'm left speechless, but when I think of Eric Holt-Giménez's career as a campesino, as an author and an academic, as an activist and an advocate, and as the director of the organization Food First, I'm left without many words. He is someone I so deeply respect and admire that I cannot fully articulate what he's done to move the food movement forward and remind us all that small-scale farmers deserve more recognition and more support for their work as teachers, businesswomen and businessmen, and stewards of natural resources and biodiversity. Following Eric's remarks, Julia Mitric from Capital Public Radio will be moderating the Transparency in the Food System panel. Please join me in welcoming my hero, Eric Holt-Giménez, to the stage.
Good morning, everybody. Thanks for answering. I should say it's great to be in Sacramento. I used to live here. I used to live here. I worked with the Stockton Farmers Market Co-op down the road, and we used to sell here in Sacramento as well as the Bay Area. So it's great to be back. I'm honored to be able to come and talk about transparency and to be the keynote for what I consider to be a very knowledgeable and experienced panel. And I want to thank Food Tank and Farm to Fork and all of the sponsors for this event and for creating a space and for identifying transparency as one of the first subjects to be addressed here. Transparency, if we think about it, is really about communication. Because why do we want something to be transparent? We want to know about it. We want to communicate about it. And communication at its core, I think, is about the right to communicate. And of course, that gets back to the right of free speech and our First Amendment rights. And so transparency is essential if we're talking about the food system. And what we want, obviously, is to have transparency throughout the entire food system. But that would mean, just as it does in our Constitution, that we would need to have the right to the freedom of speech without fear of reprisal. And we also would need communication and dialogue between equals. And the problem, of course, is Saru has just pointed out, within our food system and in our society, we aren't all equal. We're equal under the law, but we are not equal in terms of our ability to express those rights. And this is particularly true in our food system. So the challenge for us is how to create transparency and equity throughout the entire food chain. And I say equity because if some of us are less equal than others, that means we need to level the playing field. We can't have a dialogue between people who have more power over others. And since we have a stratified society, that means that equity is one of our first tasks for a sustainable and equitable food system. One of our sponsors, Driscoll's, is here, and here are some of their berries. And if we're going to talk about transparency, the first thing we see is a transparent little box, so that's good. We see that they're strawberries. Excellent. And if we read the label, we can see Driscoll's, only the finest berries, I believe that, USDA organic, and later on we see it's a product of USA. So we know where they come from, more or less, and we know that they don't have any pesticides on them. And we can infer then that the workers weren't poisoned by pesticides. These are all good things. But there's a lot more to say. And if these berries could talk, they'd have to address the questions of their own political economy. And by that I mean, who owns what? Who gets what? Who does what? And what do they do with it? They would tell us about the land, the labor, and the capital that went into producing these berries and the relationships of the people that are involved at all of those stages. They might tell us, for example, that land was stolen as most of it has been in the United States, from Native Americans. They might also say that land actually doesn't belong to the present owner, but belongs to financial houses on Wall Street who are trading little bits of value of that land at hundreds of times a second in financial markets around the world. The land has been financialized. They might also say that the land actually is very, very valuable, and one of the reasons that it's so valuable is because of the highly skilled labor that it takes to produce these berries and to pick these berries. The labor, which we call unskilled, is actually exactly the opposite. You have to pick these berries, you have to know how to do very rapid, repetitive movements all day long, sun up to sundown, day after day, for months at a time, and put up with all the, not just fatigue, but the pain. You have to aguantar, as the berry pickers say. Not too many people know how to do that, it turns out. Most of the people who do are peasants, and most of them come from Mexico, and many of them these days are indigenous. So one of the things these berries would say is that there's been a tremendous victory in terms of equity in the food system for these very berries. Because just recently, Familias Unidas por la Justicia, Families United for Justice, formed a union, the first independent farm workers union in the state of Washington, on the Sakuma Brothers Berry Farm. And they have just entered into negotiations with Sakuma, who supplies Driscoll, these may be those berries for all we know, so that the workers on that farm can have decent working conditions, will not be afraid of experiencing wage theft, will not be afraid of expressing themselves, will get a fair wage, and among other things, they would like a pension, because workers' bodies frequently wear out very quickly, and they'd like to have a pension. So this is a tremendous victory. It took 4 years. It wasn't easy to get Sakuma and Driscoll's to the table. And I think they should be congratulated now for coming to the table, for allowing the union vote to take place and the union to form. And we expect that early next year there will be an agreement. Now this only happened because the workers went on strike. That's very difficult for a worker to go on strike because then you don't get a wage. So the other thing that they did, aside from legal proceedings, was they instituted a boycott. And that's where you come in. Because people boycotted Driscoll berries. And they boycotted Driscoll berries because they knew that Sakuma was supplying Driscoll. And they did it long enough until finally all parties were able to come to the table. And what that means, that's the equity part. That's the equity part of transparency. That's leveling the playing field so that we can have an equitable dialogue, transparent dialogue, in order to reach some sort of equitable solution around our food. The lesson that I want to leave you with then, and which I'm sure our panelists will address, is that it takes social movements to create equity. Movements as a given, just as we can't take our First Amendment right as a given. We have to exercise it and make sure that it's respected. And I think as we move forward, it's going to be extremely important in all aspects of the food chain, in all aspects of the food system, to ensure that people are able to organize and that the power of social movements actually ensures that we produce and process and consume in accordance with our values. The system is not set up to do that. The rules are there, but they have to be enforced, and they have to be enforced from below. Thank you very much. And I'll just say, if you're interested, the Familias Unidas por la Justicia will be giving a press conference at noon in this hotel, and you're welcome to attend. And I should also say that our intrepid sponsor, Driscoll's, whom I really want to congratulate for, because of the win in Washington, is not quite out of the woods yet. There is still a boycott from the workers in Baja California who supply the berries, who work for the farmers who supply the berries to Driscoll's coming out of Baja California, where the wages are extremely low and conditions are very harsh. So we hope that this trend of recognizing farm worker unions and the right to organize and the right to dialogue equitably and transparently continues. Thank you.
Please welcome the Food Transparency Panel moderator, Julia Mitric with Capital Public Radio.
We're going to need one more chair, if there's one that's available. Here, your hands, I can face you. Sure, yeah, we'll take what we can get. Thank you so much. Appreciate it. Do you want to be anchor at the other end? Everybody see me on my panel? We'll just do a quick round of introductions. How's the audio doing? Everybody in the back able to hear us? Yeah? Good. So we'll just do a quick round of introductions, and then we'll just dive right in. There's a lot to talk about. So I will introduce my panel. I'm so glad to welcome you all here today. Everybody get comfortable. We're going to have a real conversation here. So welcome Nikiko Masumoto. She is a poet and fourth-generation family farmer at a certified organic farm in Del Rey near Fresno. And we have Thomas Reynolds with us. He's Vice President of Program Partnership and Learning with CARE International. And next to him is Dave Kranz, Communications and News Division Manager with the California Farm Bureau Federation. We're happy to have you. And Hannah Freeman is next, Director of Produce and Floral at Fairtrade USA. And her neighbor is Marcia Ishii-Eiteman, Senior Scientist at the Pesticide Action Network of North America. Welcome. And then we have Bruce Goldstein, the President of Farmworker Justice, and of course you all know our keynote speaker, Eric Holt-Giménez. Glad to have everybody here. So let's, we're going to encourage people to just jump in wherever they feel they can add something. And I think I'd like to just start with you, Marcia, and talk a little bit about your work. When it comes to food transparency, what's the role of scientists and researchers in bringing more transparency to the food system? And then people jump in as you like.
Great, thank you for that question, and thank you for the hosts and Food Tank for hosting this opportunity. It's great to be here, and thanks all of you for coming out. This is an excellent question. I think the importance of community-based knowledge and science for the public interest cannot be overstated. For a democracy to lose that transparency, that ability to have open, transparent research, to be able to, again, openly and honestly disclose all the information and have a serious discussion about the issues, complex problems that we are grappling with today and that we have for years, and then lead on to being able to have a really broad-based public discussion about the implications of the science and the research and the community's knowledge and all of these together. That is really important for us to be able to chart a path towards sound policy decisions that will protect our health, our children's health, our future, the ecosystems upon which we all depend, the health and equity and sustainability of our farming systems. So if a democracy loses that ability to have those transparent discussions and that open and independent science and research, then all of these other things that we value are threatened. So put another way, I think it's really important for us to look to ourselves as communities. We have incredibly rich knowledge in the farming sector. The knowledge and skills that Eric was speaking of farm workers, the knowledge of peasant farmers around the world, and of family farmers in the United States is the corner, the foundation for our food and farming systems. And it's a foundation in terms of the actual practices and the skills employed, but also becomes a foundation for us being able to make important sound policy decisions, because those frontline communities, the workers in the restaurants or on the farm, the family farmers all along the food chain, are the ones who are experiencing the direct impacts of our food and farming systems. And they have deep knowledge as to what needs to change. Basic things like not having wage theft, not being exposed to harmful pesticides in the fields, but also really major economic structural shifts that family farmers are telling us we need to have. So that's on the deep knowledge that we already have in the communities. And you asked specifically about science and research. Here, too, I really want to uphold the importance of independent science. And what has happened over the last 50 years or more is we've had a tremendous erosion of our capacity to conduct independent science for the public interest. We've got a system of land-grant universities established in the 1800s, did quite a bit of really solid research, but over the past decades, three things have happened. We've had a systematic defunding of these public land-grant and public research institutions. We've had corporate industries, notably the agribusiness sector, pesticide producers, the purveyors of genetically modified seeds and fertilizers and grain traders and so on, investing, filling the void of the absence of public funds. So these corporate entities have invested heavily in land-grant universities. We now have endowed chairs of sustainability by the likes of Monsanto and Dow and DuPont across our land grants. The agribusinesses have been able to sponsor buildings and departments, sit on advisory boards, on graduate student committees. So in our university systems, we're losing the capacity to do that public independent science for the benefit of the public good. And this continues. We see the same thing happening in our federal agencies. So the U.S. Department of Agriculture, we can speak more about this. It's a bigger picture of a revolving door of industry players moving in and out of our federal agencies. But as a result, we have a USDA that has approved every single genetically modified pesticide promoting seed that has come across the desktop. We have an EPA that has ceded science to the pesticide industry and only looks at basically at industry supplied safety studies on its products. And on the other hand, we have a situation where at the USDA, which has a nearly $3 billion agricultural research budget, $2.8 billion, only 1.5% of that goes to research into agroecological ecologically resilient farming practices, the kind of farming, we'll talk about this in a bit, that we really need to be moving our country towards.
Okay, I want to thank you, Marcia. I want to bring in Bruce Goldstein for a minute, just to talk about, picking up on some of the themes from Eric's talk. What can eaters do to learn more about the people who plant, weed, and harvest and pack our food? What could you add to that? And people jump in again as you like. Let's adjust your mic a little bit to make sure folks can hear you. Try again.
Can you hear me now?
Can we bring Bruce's mic up a little bit?
I think I'm number 3.
Lucky number 3.
There we go. Thanks again for having me. My organization, Farmworker Justice, is located in Washington, D.C., and we work nationally on issues related to farm workers, especially around immigration, labor rights, occupational safety, health, and access to health care. And we work with groups all over the country, including many in California. We are in the background helping on some legal issues with Fabulous Unidas por la Justicia, and are very excited about the potential for a collective bargaining agreement there, because we actively support groups that are organizing to achieve change. You'll find on our website a lot of links to many of the groups around the country that are organizing, that are serving farm workers in other ways. On our website, you'll find some, I think, valuable information. For example, a demographic portrait of farm workers. There are about 2.5 million farm workers in this country, not including about 2 million of their family members here in the US. Most are quite poor. The large majority are foreign-born. A majority of farm workers are undocumented immigrants, and therefore they face incredible challenges and difficulties, and our immigration system is very broken. We find that there are rampant violations of farm workers' rights, and you'll see our reports. One of the big developments over the last number of years has been increasing use by farm operators of farm labor contractors, and often the farm operators will say to the farm labor contractor, here's some money, take care of the wages, complying with the labor law, and a lot of times that just doesn't happen, and often the farm labor contractor doesn't really have the resources needed to comply with the law or treat farm workers fairly. And if you sue the farm labor contractor, often they don't have the assets to pay the court judgment. So one of the things we work on is trying to instill greater responsibility in the food supply system. And we do that in a number of ways. One is to really advocate for immigration reform. We need undocumented immigrant farm workers to have the opportunity to earn legal immigration status and a path to citizenship. We advocate for much stronger enforcement of worker rights. We support worker organizing. We support helping farm worker groups educate farm workers about their rights, about how to prevent injuries and illnesses. You'll find on our reports that agriculture is one of the most dangerous jobs in the United States in terms of fatalities on the job and injuries on the job. There needs to be a lot more effort on that front. Very few farm workers are accessing health care. Even undocumented immigrants are eligible for the federally funded community health centers. But due to language obstacles and other barriers, only about 20-25% of farm workers are using those community health centers. One of the things that we're very excited about is the rise of corporate social responsibility projects in agriculture. We co-founded one of them. There are others, but the one we're working on is the Equitable Food Initiative. A couple of retailers, some growers, and worker organizations are involved in that. And the idea is to find ways to improve productivity and share the value, the profit that arises from that shared profitability, that increased profitability. Share it along the food supply chain. So we're optimistic that consumers who will read about this will go to their supermarkets and say, hey, why don't you participate in one of these corporate social responsibility projects so that farm workers are treated with greater respect.
So this is great. I'm going to ask everybody to think a little bit as we continue our conversation about, from your own perspective, what kind of infrastructure needs to be in place to support transparency, and maybe we'll just kind of have people weigh in on that. I want to bring in Dave Kranz to the conversation. Dave, you work with such a wide variety of farmers and growers, big and small. Do you feel like the work of the Farm Bureau is clear to those who aren't part of agribusiness? And what tools have you found? I mean, the huge part of your job is to communicate across this very wide spectrum and to the public. So what tools are effective in communicating the Bureau's role, and what are you hearing about the need for transparency from your constituents?
Well, you're correct, Julia. We're the big tent organization. We represent farmers of all types, all sizes, all crops, and have been around for almost 100 years, since 1919. So we seek commonality. What are the common issues that affect farmers, no matter what they grow, no matter where they grow it, no matter what production system they use? And our organization has been involved from its very beginning in a fair amount of outreach about where food comes from, how it's grown, and why it matters. If you live in California, why it matters that your food is grown in California. So we produce a weekly newspaper. We produce for a farm audience. For the non-farm audience, we produce a weekly television program called California Bountiful and a bi-monthly magazine also by that name. We are on social media, we're on the web, we talk to reporters all the time. We probably, in an average year, respond to about 600 media inquiries. So we're always trying to push out information as much as possible and be as transparent as we can be about who's growing your food, where it's coming from, and the various forces that affect their ability to do that successfully in California. We have a lot of advantages as California farmers and ranchers. We have great climate, good soils. Sometimes we have adequate water, and we have, of course, large markets. We have many of the largest cities in the country right next to our farms, which can be a good thing and a bad thing. So there are a lot of advantages we have, but there are also a lot of added burdens, if you will, that farmers here feel in terms of increased regulation and ways of kind of overseeing farms that farmers in other states don't have to deal with. And we're fine dealing with that. It's just that, you as a shopper can help those farmers who are working through some of those extra requirements by looking at the label and looking for California-grown foods and other farm products.
Great, so this seems like a great moment to bring in from the Farm Bureau to a family farm, Nikiko Masumoto, and also maybe Hannah Freeman. You're doing some work in the area of bringing greater transparency to the many levels between the growers and the farm laborers themselves. So Nikiko, let's start with you. I mean, how does you're an organic, certified organic farm, a fourth generation family farm, how does transparency play out in the way that your farm and your family, interact with the community, and what's playing out for you in that area?
Yeah, so when we in the Masumoto family farm, usually our big idea conversations happen in the kitchen, right? And so when we're thinking about transparency, oftentimes for us, the framing ends up being in story. How do we tell our story? And at the same time, how do we acknowledge and navigate the power and privileges that are always embroiled with who we are, where we are, and what we're doing? And for us, that the framing of story is really helpful because it gets us to think about audience, and it gets us to try to break away from thinking of consumers as consumers, and instead we often think about audience more akin to artists, thinking about audience as a partner in the production of an experience, right? We so often forget that food is an aesthetic experience. It's an embodied experience. So we borrow from theater and performance in wanting to think about how we cross that barrier, how we cross that divide between eaters and farmers, and simultaneously wanting to make sure that we're doing our job being self-critical, self-aware, and intentional about how we're empowering the people who are behind the food that we grow, our farm workers. And I couldn't agree more with Bruce that if we really want the cultural equity that Eric Holt-Giménez is challenging us to strive for, we have to think about the policy levels of how we can give people a voice at the table. And then simultaneously, I think we need to think about the emotional landscape of food. And that if we want a productive dialogue with people, with neighbors, one of my neighbors, we come from completely opposite political viewpoints. And at the same time, over years and years of rural waves, in rural places, if you wave, you have to get a wave back. We've developed a space now where we can try to navigate some of our political differences from a spot of emotional integrity. And that's what excites me about the possibility of approaching food and equity through stories.
Okay, great. This leads us, I think, into Hannah. And again, people feel, anyone can feel welcome to jump in. Hannah, and then I'm going to also bring Thomas in to talk a little bit about the international perspective and gender equity issues when it comes to land ownership. Hannah, tell us a little bit about that work that you're doing and how transparency is, greater transparency is possible in those layers between growers and the folks who are doing the work in the fields.
Yeah, so thank you. I think a lot of us are aligned on sort of why we want to drive transparency, obviously from the fork to the farm, and I really am hoping that the next level of, next chapter in this story is to drive transparency from the farm to the farm worker. And that's for two reasons. One is because as we work with growers and farm workers, we find so many issues that go entirely undetected, not just by the brands and the retailers and the consumers, but by the grower himself or herself. I'll give you an example that came in on our helpline. A farm worker called us from southern Mexico. He had worked for 4 months in northern Mexico, made a couple $1,000s, working very, very hard in the hot sun. Got home, and before he could get off the bus, the recruiter took half of his money. And this could happen, does happen with H-2A workers in different ways. It happens on this side of the border, perhaps less severely in different regions. But stories like that are pretty common, and so the question really is how do we find out what's really going on? As you probably figure at Fair Trade USA, we have standards, labor standards, environmental standards, economic standards. We send out auditors to check compliance with those standards. They might be at a farm for 3 or 4 days at a time, interview dozens of farm workers. They nearly always find things going on that the grower has no idea about. I'd love to see a show of hands. Who has worked at a company where you feel like the top management is a little bit out of touch with what goes on at the bottom? Don't raise your hand if your boss is here, right? Now think about that context. Think about if there was a language barrier there. You didn't speak the language of your bosses. Think about if there were cultural barriers there. If there was a climate of fear, particularly around the threat of deportation and being separated from your family. You add all of those elements to the normal hierarchy, and the flow of information just slows to a trickle. If you're not hearing that the bathrooms are broken and plugged up, or that there is wage theft, or that protective equipment isn't being used properly, people are using dust masks when they need to be using respirators, you're going to have the risk of food safety recalls, very, very costly, of reputational risks to your brand, to your company, and then I think what we really need to figure out is how do we lift that blanket of silence that is sort of insulating the people with the decision-making power from the workers that are out in the field. We've been experimenting with a number of tools that I want to share with you, but I'll say that these tools mean nothing if there's not a foundation of trust. And that means first figuring out, how do you ensure non-retaliation? How do you ensure that you have the resources to actually see through a real and lasting resolution? If you don't have those ingredients first, these tools will be a waste of your money. So one tool that is common on fair trade, well, it's required on fair trade farms, is a fair trade committee or a farm worker committee. Workers elect their peers. Supervisors, recruiters, farm labor contractors, they are not allowed on the committee. It's just the base level worker. And that committee has to reflect the makeup of the workforce. So if the workforce is half women, committee is half women. If the workforce is half indigenous people, the committee is half indigenous people. And at first when we tell the growers that this is a requirement, they are terrified, right? Especially if they have any history in unions. But what we see is when they find the courage, because they have to go through with that, it becomes one of the most valuable and rewarding parts of this certainly for the farm workers and also for the grower, where they have this platform of dialogue where workers get to share solutions and share problems that previously were being silenced by the middle managers. Another tool that we've been piloting is a helpline. And this is very effective for detecting the sort of the worst problems. It might be a one-off, might be a couple of people experiencing them where there's sexual harassment, human trafficking, major wage theft, that sort of things. But it's a huge investment. You can't just set up a 1-800 number. You have to have operators that speak the language, that are trained to talk to farm workers, to draw them out, to make them feel comfortable, that know enough to be a resource to farm workers. And you have to, again, have the resources and the commitment to follow these things through to resolution, or your hotline will quickly die. Another tool that we've used are surveys. We've used mobile phone surveys with our partner Good World Solutions, and we used Android tablets with an app called TerraWorks to do surveys by enumerators in the fields with farm workers. Surveys are really useful for understanding trends. They're a little less useful for finding the one-off severe issues because you just might not pick it up in the sample size. And then finally, another idea that I've heard growers doing themselves is just listening sessions or listening tours where the top management takes the time to sit down with farm workers in a neutral setting without their supervisors, without middlemen, without the FLCs, and listen to them. And again, that is something that only over time are you going to be able to build that trust by showing you listen, showing you follow through. But the exciting thing of all of this is, imagine, if you were that guy that had half his wages taken away as he came home, are you going to want to go back to that farm? No. And what are we facing in farm work is just a major labor shortage, very severe in the US, getting more severe every day in Mexico and in other countries, because farm workers want other options. They want a better life. They want to move into construction or lumber or retail because they're having these experiences. And so by investing in these transparency tools, we can, improve these jobs, make them dignified and desirable and safe, and therefore, improve the bottom line. Once businesses, see that bottom line paying off, this will just become a self-perpetuating cycle. So that's what's exciting.
So this is a good transition, I think, to Thomas, because we've talked about the Californian context and the U.S. context, but we're really all embedded in this global food system. And of course, CARE is an international NGO and development agency. So I'd love to hear if you have any stories or any lessons that you've taken away from other NGOs and businesses about how to, that have helped make the work that you do more transparent to farmers and governments and donors and the folks that you work with.
Yeah, thanks. CARE is an organization that exists to save lives, defeat poverty, and achieve social justice. And I was just thinking about this idea of story and thinking about food through story. And I loved your question about, as eaters, what do we think about? And because I've spent a lot of the last 10 years traveling to different countries and seeing agriculture in many different settings. When I pick up a peach or when I pick up a head of lettuce, I think, who's touched this? What is the gender of the person who planted the seeds? What's the gender of the person who does the accounting? What's the gender of the person who picks the financing options? And what we understand throughout the world is women produce half of the world's food, but only own 1% of the world's farmland. And so when we think about transparency, I think we need to think about not only what are the inputs and what's the value chain, but also who is participating in that. Also just thinking about the real challenges around climate change and water, and how asymmetrical information information that maybe possibly larger holders understand and can influence the way water is directed, or anticipating the impact of severe weather. This is something that also we're thinking about in terms of the smallholder farmer. How do we create opportunities for solidarity groups to come together to share information and to understand the potential impacts of what El Nino, for instance, is doing in sub-Saharan Africa and the Horn of Africa right now, preparing more drought-resistant crops, and just helping smallholders participate in the markets in ways that they probably wouldn't be able to do if there wasn't more opportunities for information.
So, I mean, that kind of opens things up a little bit more to, you know, thinking about our eaters, our consumers. You know, we've talked about how people are aware of, maybe a little bit more aware of whether this food is grown with pesticides or without, but what level of awareness do you think there is in the public for the working conditions that, you know, have produced this food, and some of the implications about, you know, who owns the land and who works on the land? Does anybody want to jump in on that? I mean, are you hearing more concern about that?
Well, I'll just say a few years ago, on one of my visits to California, I was talking to a colleague who helps farm workers in California, and I was saying, you know, California is different. It has passed laws that give farm workers most of the labor protections that other workers have in California, whereas at the federal level, farm workers are excluded from most labor laws. And so, you know, people are really paying attention, and this is the agricultural production state for the country. And my friend said, Bruce, you don't get it. Farm workers are just as invisible in California as they are elsewhere in the country. And so a lot of us have been working, you know, for a number of years to try to, you know, raise the voices, lift the voices of farm workers themselves, so that people in the public understand that there are people who work in the fields and are asked to make sure that that strawberry doesn't have any green shoulders on it and is not overripe, so that when it arrives in the supermarket, it's going to have the maximum shelf life and still be fresh and sweet. And that takes an exercise of judgment. And farm workers should be paid for that exercise of judgment. So a lot of us have been working in the past few years to really try to work with farmer groups all over the country to use social media, traditional media, conferences like this, to raise the voices of farm workers and to show people where their food comes from. So I'm very appreciative to be here today.
And Dave, I'd be interested to hear from you. I mean, do farmers and growers talk about, you know, those layers between themselves and the people that are working on their farms? Do you hear that issue percolating up from farmers themselves as to knowing their labor force better, knowing that they'll have some stability with that labor force? I mean, do you hear those conversations coming through your filter?
Well, there's a great deal of concern, and we've been very involved, again, in looking at immigration reform. We know the current system isn't working. We know that it does lead to exploitation in some cases. The existing H-2A program doesn't really work in California because it's not flexible enough to deal with the very significant swings in when a crop harvest might start and when you need the people there at the right time. Farmers want to have people who are in the country legally, who aren't under that pressure of being an illegal immigrant. They recognize that many of the people who are here now aren't in that situation. At the same time, if a farm employer is presented with documentation that appears to be adequate, they have to accept that. So they're stuck in this kind of mid-range too, where you can't, you have to assume that people are presenting you documentation that is legal, and you want to have people who are legal. So we have been working for a long time to try to improve that system so it works better for everybody, the employer and the employee as well.
Thomas, let's...
Yeah, I'm just thinking, you know, treating people with respect and dignity is good for business. In Sri Lanka, CARES launched a social enterprise called Chrysalis, and they provide space for women in tea plantations to come together and talk about working conditions that they want to work under, and promotes dialogue with owners within the tea plantation sector. The return on investment when owners invest in health, education, and good working conditions is 16 to 1. For every $1 ownership is investing in better working conditions through reduced injuries, reduced sickness, and reduced work stoppage, they're getting a 16 to 1 return. So I think it's just good for business for people who are responsible for capital inputs for making those types of decisions.
And Hannah?
Yeah, that makes me think about this challenge that I think so many businesses face, which is what is easy to measure and what is hard to measure. It's really easy to measure the line that you have to put into your budget to provide health care or whatever the benefit or whatever the sort of improvement, provide, protective equipment that's twice as expensive and good training. It's harder to measure the results from that, but I think that is a great challenge that smart business people should take on. Start measuring turnover. Start measuring employee satisfaction. Start measuring quality in ways that farm workers have an influence on. Start measuring how clean your facilities are in terms of food safety, because these are the results you get, but if you don't measure them, those budget lines become very vulnerable when push comes to shove.
Let's have Marcia and Nikiko then.
Yeah, I wanted to bring the conversation drawing on this rich thread about what can we do to address the injustices that farm workers face and the lack of access to healthy, affordable food that is the reality across the country, not just in urban communities, but in rural communities, as well as the plight of family farmers who are experiencing farm foreclosures at a rate never seen before, losing their farms, losing access to their livelihoods. There is a way we can turn this system around, and it will require some of the structural changes that you were alluding to earlier, Julia. But let me back up for us to, and get to the transparency aspect. For us to really be able to move solutions forward, we need to understand exactly where we are at. Eric was raising some of these questions in the plenary about who benefits, who controls, who's making the decisions, who has the power and the privilege, and who does not. And so I want to speak to corporate power, the power of the agribusiness industry specifically. We have seen over the past decades an unprecedented consolidation of the agribusiness industry. Just 6 companies control 3/4, 75% of the pesticide industry. We call them the big 6 pesticide companies. 3 giant pesticide and seed companies control over 1/2 of the world's global seed supply. And one company, Monsanto, alone controls 1/4 of the world's seed supply. This is a very dangerous situation. And right now, it's been in the news, we are seeing another wave of mega mergers with Dow and DuPont getting together, Bayer, Syngenta and ChemChina, and Bayer and Monsanto most recently. So we've just had hearings in this past week looking into these antitrust, the implications for monopoly control of the food system, antitrust hearings. We've gone through this actually some years ago as well. I was testifying at the DOJ, Department of Justice, in 2010 around this trend of corporate consolidation that is throwing farmers off the land, is causing poverty wages for poultry workers and for farm workers across the food and farming system. So that justice investigation conducted for a year, pulled forward tons of information, led nowhere. The report was buried. The Deputy Attorney General who was leading it resigned. We need to, and here's where all of you come in, we are seeing this another round of mega mergers. This is very dangerous for the sustainability and the equity of our food and farming system. When we stop these mega mergers, we need to call upon our Justice Department to put a stop to it. We have a petition that Pesticide Action Network, Food and Water Watch, and others just sent to the Justice Department and President Obama. Nearly 750,000 people signed this petition. The petition is still live. You can go to our website and look under the Online Action Center and add your name. The problem is, when we have this much consolidation of market share, that translates directly into political power and a corrupting influence over our public agencies. And that's why we have the situation we have today with all these rampant violations of human rights that we're experiencing and seeing across the country. We have a corporate lobby that has put nearly over $500 million. The 50 biggest biotech and chemical companies spent over $500 million in one 10-year period, lobbying Congress, the USDA, National Institute for Health, all of these agencies. We have a revolving door. Linda Fisher is a good example, Deputy Administrator for the Environmental Protection Agency under Bush and Clinton, then with Monsanto, back to EPA, now she's at DuPont. So this is happening. Meanwhile, the corporate lobby and these industries have determined that it's not enough to buy our public agencies, but they're also directing a tremendous public relations campaign at all of us. Now we're seeing that more money is being spent in public relations, in PR campaigns. Again, over $500 million just in 4 years. In a 4-year period, Monsanto spent $300 million. And that's to put out misinformation, to have misinformed conversations, to control the public conversation. Eric was speaking to the need to have really honest conversations, and that is absolutely the case if we're to get to the bottom of what's wrong with our food and farming system. So all of these things are areas in which the people can and are engaging, calling for campaign finance reform and end to these corruptions.
I hate to cut Marcia off because she's one of my heroes as well, but this honest conversation, I want to bring that to the audience right now and have some questions from the audience. We have about time for 2 questions. This is my fault. We're running a little bit late. And so I just want to make sure that for this panel in particular, we get some questions from the audience. So let's take 2. I know it's hard for you to see. It's hard for me to see, too.
You can raise your hand. We'll get a mic to you.
Okay, there's someone over here in the front.
Danielle, you go ahead and spot, and then.
I need like a visor to do this. Right here, this gentleman right there. And just a reminder to keep your questions short, please.
How do you define transparency in both creating the most direct connection to people between consumers and farm workers, but also protecting businesses from essentially vendors hawking each other's suppliers? It's an argument that I face all the time trying to create transparency in the produce industry with institutions in California, with many of our colleagues here. And I can clarify that if that doesn't make sense up front.
Who wants to jump in on that? Eric?
Yeah, well, I think that first of all, we need a larger structural framework for transparency. And then the mechanisms for transparency will become much more apparent and much easier to implement. And I think the largest framework or lack of transparency are our international trade rules. The free trade agreements, which are conducted in secret, in which the mega corporations basically sit down at the table and decide which privileges they're going to give to each other over and above the constitutions of the different countries in which they do business. I think on one hand, it's morally reprehensible, it's completely undemocratic, and 3, it ruins the entire environment for transparency throughout the rest of the food chain. And we've already seen 20 years of these free trade agreements and what the effects have been. The effects have been mass bankruptcies, particularly in the Global South. Most of the farm workers that are working up here today are farmers from the Global South. They can no longer make a living because of the subsidized grains from the north being dumped into their markets, and they can't compete. That's just one small example. This hasn't brought jobs to the US. It hasn't brought transparency to our system. So the definition of transparency, I think, has to begin at the very top with those who are sabotaging transparency. These free trade rules and the free trade agreements have to be completely renegotiated, and they've got to be renegotiated transparently. Otherwise, I don't think we have a chance of making the other areas of transparency stick.
Okay. Let's see. Do we have another? On the left. Okay, on the left.
Hi. I wanted to change the conversation just a little bit as far as transparency. I haven't heard a lot being said about food access. The question is, what's the point of all the changes that we're making if we don't educate the consumers, the large population of consumers that have no idea what's happening here today. They have no idea of the problems that are facing our farm workers and our industry. So they're not going to go out and spend that extra on the organic and go to Whole Foods and whatnot. What is going to be done to do that? Because if we don't grow the customer base, all these changes are going to be for naught because the farmers aren't going to make money. And I don't see a whole lot going on with that. So,
Okay, anyone want to jump in on that about how to communicate those stories to the public?
Sure. I am super fortunate to have been lucky to be born into a family with a father who is a writer, and he has been courageous in telling the story of our farm and also being an advocate for farm workers in the public sphere. So I know that on a small scale, I truly believe if we can develop a language, a shared language about what sustainable practices, what transparent practices, what truly equitable practices look like, that's at least a beginning of shared language. I know there's a lot of people doing media projects. I know Anna LePay is doing a whole bunch around trying to access, trying to spread messages and critical thinking to a much wider audience. I don't know that there's a single answer, but maybe 1,000 tiny answers together will help move the needle.
Anyone else want to bring the question of food access into the conversation as well? I mean, I know that's something that I've reported about in Sacramento, that we have just so many families, so many children lacking basic food. So if I understand what your question was partially about was, when people are just concerned with making it through the month in terms of having some kind of nutritious food, then these higher level conversations that we're having become irrelevant when you're really just trying to put food on the table. Bruce?
Oh, briefly, I mean, there is a tremendous...
Here, switch your mic just a little bit so you can, or bring it a little bit closer to you. Yeah.
Sorry. I mean, there is a tremendous irony that for a lot of farm workers, their wages are so low that they really can't afford the safe, fresh, healthy food that they and their children need to be healthy. We need to work on improving wages and working conditions for farm workers so they can afford the food when it is available.
I would just like to add on that point that I think also much larger than this particular conversation is another one that we need to be having, and this is fundamentally about transparency. We need to talk about racism in the food and farming system and in our society. I mean, we've just had yet more police killings this past week. The systemic and institutionalized racism that is throughout our society is devastating. We're seeing police, physical violence and murders, and economic violence, particularly against African Americans. Young black men are being shot down in the streets. This is intimately connected with this conversation about food and farming. It's the racism in our society that is devastating communities across the country, and is linked to why there has been in the food and farming sector this dispossession of African Americans, of Latinos, of indigenous people from their lands, of Japanese Americans from their lands during World War II. There were African American farmers owned 16 million acres, not in this century, not too long ago, and now it's down to 1 million acres. And this is not just by accident. We need to talk about the racism that is in our minds, in our institutions. The USDA Farm Services Agency recently just evicted Dorothy and Eddie Wise from their farm in North Carolina, African-American farmers. This is happening every day, and so we need to grapple with this. And what I'm heartened by is that we are beginning to have in this country some of these courageous conversations about a very difficult topic, right? And these conversations are allowing us to connect the dots, to see some of the structural institutions that are in place that are keeping racism in place and that are dividing people and causing extreme poverty. We can also talk about issues around class and gender equity. To get to this beautiful food and farming system that we know to be possible, we won't get there until we address the corporate control that I was speaking of earlier and the racism, the classism in our society. And the exciting thing is that this is beginning to happen. Just Civil Eats recently in July carried a great post, you can look it up, conversations connecting Black Lives Matter and food justice movements. There's incredible work being done by colorofchange.org. You can go to that website and see how you can get involved. Just start reading. The Civil Eats had a lot of links. For example, eloquent speeches by Beatrice Beckford of the National Black Food Justice Alliance. So start reading, bring these conversations to those you're sitting with, to your neighbors, to your friends. Find ways to engage. There are many avenues to engage, and we need to come out. And this again gets to transparency, having these open, honest conversations. We need to have the conversation we want to have, not the ones that the corporations are trying to distract us with.
What a great point to end on. Thank you so much, Marcia. You gave us a little bit of hope.